All right, so we're picking up from here. Um, Hopefully we can get through the rest. Right. All right. So getting people to lead themselves. So we talked about that a little bit already. So we should be okay with that concept. All right. Being exclusive or inclusive, I should say, means developing the strengths and talents of group members so that they can contribute to the group's goals. So it's not going to be enough to be able to just be a participative leader, but you have to be able to get people fully engaged in the organization. And organizational culture has to change to effectively involve people. And that's one of the problems that a lot of organizations, especially older organizations that have developed some very negative cultures to be able to change their view of different people coming into the organization. Um, One that comes to mind is the Ministry of Education, especially in schools that have been in existence for a long time. You get that sort of uh, organizational culture creep taking place in the organization where it it makes you could come in with some very great ideas, but because you're dealing with an organization that has a very fixed culture, it can negatively impact upon the individuals and force you to have to change your behaviors to match theirs. And that's something that leadership has to be dealing with as well. To be able to recognize that parts of organizational culture have to also evolve in order to get people to engage differently. Um, and that can be serious issues that have to be faced, especially with organizations that have been in existence for long periods of time. All right, and in addition to the practice, the language of inclusivity has to be used. How we talk about people, how we talk with people, how we refer to people has to be inclusive in nature. Um, think about how we use we and I, and that conversation that you have with people. The we have to do this and we have to do that. Um, what does it so when you hear somebody using a lot of I like to do this and I do this and I do that, that it kind of makes you feel a bit strange about the individual. um
Supreme narcissist vibes.
Say again, sorry.
Supreme narcissist vibes.
Narcissistic, yeah, I suppose, yeah, that's but the main thing though, it negates against inclusive thinking. um when somebody is I this, I that, I the next. But when we talk about we will do this and we will do that and we have to do this and we have this to accomplish and so on. This is especially something that leaders, especially in meetings, have to pay attention to. That we have to be able to do this and so you have to use the language of inclusivity rather
Yeah,
than
exactly. As I was saying, it addresses the as a collective, it's we in this together kind of
yeah.
vibe.
That's a very important element there in terms of being inclusive. Right. Groups would benefit by examining practices that might block inclusivity. So when you work in groups in the small projects that you do within the classroom, for example, you have to be paying attention to what you've been doing, um, that may be negating against inclusiveness in your group activity. This is especially where you have people who come from a very similar background working suddenly with somebody who comes from a different background, and how you'll go about doing things. So you have to be open to the variations that those individuals bring to the table in relation to how that group behaves and organizes themselves. All right. Those members might like to use consensus modeling of decision making to ensure that the views of all are included in each significant decision. So consensus is a dangerous model, but it's one of the models that can be utilized for developing a more um, inclusive approach to decision making processes. And everybody understands this consensus model. You may not agree with the method, but you agree to disagree, but you still support it. That's the difference. That you might not like the choice that was being made, but you are still going to go along with it because that's the consensus of the group. Now, it still has a problem where sometimes it can marginalize people in that grouping. So you have to be careful with that as well in terms of doing that. It also means identifying the shareholders and stakeholders external to the group who have some responsibility or interest in the change that is being planned. So that this is one of the reasons why organizations, when they're making massive changes, they have to do um, what we call focus groups, because you have to bring to bear in your decision making what do the stakeholders and shareholders have to gain or lose from the changes that are external to the organization or the group that you're working with. Because if you're not bringing them in, then you're not truly being inclusive across the board. All right. Um, this is especially in organizations that have, like for example, every time we have to make changes in Costa, we have a tendency to have a lot of focus group activities, which again is time consuming, especially if the change that we're trying to make is one that is a large change and major changes that come up. We have to do focus groups to be able to include students and other stakeholders in the decision making process. Stakeholders may not hold the same view of the problem nor the solutions, and a stakeholder's position on an issue is influenced by the importance with which they view it. So if you don't see it as being a critical thing, then you're not going to be invested in that particular decision, and that can create some problems. Stakeholders' response is more understandable. They work to more being As they work towards being more inclusive, rational leaders will want to assess possible stakeholders' reaction in determining their approaches. So they kind of have to do some guesstimation, some evaluation of understanding where stakeholders might be coming from, what is because the decision that you're making may not be of critical importance to them, and therefore they may not view it as being a big issue. And therefore, that will determine the strategies you're going to utilize as the leader to be able to bring them into the decision making process and get them to buy into the choices that you're making. That's something that a lot of people have to deal with. Um, Even if they disagree, they should be involved. Involvement helps stakeholders to gain new views on the issue. So you're hoping that your stakeholders are going to be open-minded enough that even though they may not agree with what choices you're making, they're still going to be at least aware of why you're doing what you're doing. So you have to try and make sure that they have understood why you're doing what you're doing. Additionally, you have to be open to the fact that a stakeholder might be able to see aspects or perceptions of the issue or the problem that we inside the organization cannot see. And that's really the strength of bringing in stakeholders, because remember, their perception is going to be different because they're viewing things from a different place, from outside of the organization, and therefore they're likely to see things that we may not be able to see from sitting inside our organization. And those are really important to be able to develop better decisions in the long run, and of course to form better coalitions with the people around you, and of those are you external to the organization but affected by the organization as well. This is again one of the reasons why we always have to meet with our students. Then we also have to we have something called PACs, program advisory committees, which are people who employ our students. We tend to bring them in to ask them questions about the program. And then they're not going to know a lot about the education element, but what they're going to know is about what the what the student does when they arrive in their workplace and how they respond and react to certain things. Those are things that are important to us. And they would also say, well, we would like to have students or trainees coming out who can do X, Y, Z, and that helps to shape our degree programs based upon what the clients want outside there. That's an important element that we tend to utilize. Most organizations should use that kind of process as well when making those decisions. So this is a sort of stakeholder response chart that you could look at in terms of dealing with um, how the various stakeholders and shareholders can respond to stuff. So on the x-axis, we're measuring perspectives or stands on the issues, and on the y-axis, we're looking at the degree of importance to the stakeholder. So you realize that if there's a high level of importance, if we're in this region here, let me turn on this thing again. If we're in this region here of high importance and high opposition, then you're going to have high levels of antagonism taking place. If it's of high importance to the stakeholder and they highly support it, then they're going to be supportive. You want to bring everybody into this realm. If it's of low importance, but it's of high opposition, then it's going to be a problematic change that you want to be making. And then, of course, you have low priority, good high support for it, but it's of very low importance to them, then it's low priority. So if you start to, place your issues and goals into these categories, then it will help you to develop a strategy to treat with them. So especially those that you expect high opposition and it's of critical importance to the stakeholder, then you're gonna have to work with strategies to find out if I come with these types of stuff that falls into this category, what strategies can I actually be utilizing or should I be utilizing to help bring the group or bring the decision making across to this area here to be more supportive across the board, as opposed to being antagonistic or problematic. All right, so that's just a way of looking at the involvement of external stakeholders to your decision making process, change process that you're bringing to the organization. All right, so empowerment is the other element we talked about. Thriving on change demands the empowerment of every person in the organization. Empowerment has two dimensions. One, the sense of self that claims ownership, claims a place in the process, and expects to be involved. So that's individuals now who develop a sense of self ownership and they want to be involved and they expect to be involved in the organization. And then the second is a set of environmental conditions that promote the full involvement of participants by reducing the barriers that block the development of individual talent and involvement. So those are the two areas of empowerment that you're looking at: individual empowerment and conditions of empowerment. So those are the two main things that you have to do as a leader. Help to develop that sense of self-empowerment as well as set up the environment in which that empowerment is encouraged and not challenged. And that happens in some kind of situations. People claim to be empowered, but when they try to do something, the process or the bureaucracy stands in the way of getting those things done. That's something that a lot of leaders don't pay attention to. They themselves say, listen, I want you all to be able to do this and take charge of these things. But when they do so, they're then bogged down by the bureaucracy of the organization and says, well, you can't do this without having this signed by so and so, and then this person has to sign that and so on. And that just negates against the whole situation of empowering people. So you have people who feel empowered and want to work and contribute to the goal that you're trying to get, but the system or the environment that you created is preventing that from happening. You have to make sure that those things work in tandem with each other. All right. Empowerment is claimed I have a legitimate right to be here and say what I feel and think, as well as shared with others. You should be involved in this. That's the phrasing that we look at. You have a right to be here to tell us what you think and feel. That's in language. Being empowered means mitigating aspects of the environmental climate that can block meaningful involvement of others. So that you're not shutting other people out. You are trying to make sure that all the systems work towards everybody working together. Empowering environments are learning climates in which people expect successes yet know they can learn from failures or mistakes. We talked about this a few times before about making sure that you're not setting up a situation where people are going to be punished or they're going to be getting some sort of punitive um, treatment as a result of something's going wrong. It's important that we set up a situation where we are constantly learning and we learn from the errors that we make. It's important to establish organizational environments that empower others to do and to be their best. So that's the job of empowerment. That's what you'll be looking for. So they go on to speak here about the root word of empowerment is power. Understanding power dynamics is essential in moving towards a philosophical commitment to empowerment. Where possible, positional leaders must be willing to share their power or authority, and participants must be willing to assume more responsibility for it. So this is another aspect of it, or a critical aspect of empowerment. Because the word power sits in that word, it means that the power has to be shared. And if you have leaders who are unwilling to share their power, then it's going to prevent the whole process from taking place. So leaders in positional situations or in leadership positions have to be willing to share the power. And that is a challenge for some people, especially those who are short-sighted. They don't want to give up their authority. But more importantly, if they do give up their authority, the person receiving the authority to act must be willing to assume the responsibility for if anything goes wrong, and own up to it, as the case would be. So power is a two-way street. If you want power, then you have to take the consequences of it. But you also have to be willing to give that power up. All right. Power has been traditionally viewed as zero sum, meaning it's all or nothing. You either have power or you have none. It's not about sharing the power. So conventional approaches assume that if one person is in an organization is very very powerful, then everybody else has less power. The difference in power therefore exists concurrently among people in any relation. Power dynamics range from power over, which is autocratic, to power with, that's collaborative, and power alongside, that's collegial. So we like to think in COSTAT, for example, we have a lot of collegial power, meaning that we have the power together to make decisions. But if you find that the power over the autocratic power that exists in the organization exceeds the amount of collaborative and collegial power, then one negates the other. So you have to find balance in them to be able to get it to work well. Um, because if it doesn't, you're not going to get the mix right. And that power dynamic is going to create problems in the long run. Some approaches to leadership would go further and describe power from referring to the authority and power afforded to the leader from a group of participants. Effective positional leaders know that their power and ability to be effective comes from the members of their group and their participants. So your power in any organization is based upon who you represent from a leadership position. If you represent a set of individuals who take no responsibility for their actions and they do very little, then you're not going to be in a position that gives you much power or say when organizational decisions are being made, because your voice represents a weakened set of organizational members. Whereas if your members are empowered and act well together and contribute a lot to the organizational development and growth, then you would have a more say as a positional power person that represents their interests, especially at the executive meetings. So that's something that is important, because if you know you're speaking on behalf of people who actually get the work done, then people will have to listen to you, because if they don't, then they run the risk of that aspect of the organization becoming um, disenfranchised with the organization. That could be negative for the organization moving forward. Sources of power. Now, there's a chapter that is going to deal with this in a lot more detail. So, sources of power would be how power arrives, or how you get power in an organization. So the bases of power, there's social power, expert power, reverent power, legitimate power, coercive power, and reward power. So expert power is the power of information or knowledge. So this is somebody who really knows their stuff. And because they're an expert in the field, that gives them power because people will come to you and say, you know, I need to get this done. And I know you're the person to come to get that thing. We have a tendency to trust people who are experts because they know the let's say you're having an IT issue, you're going to somebody who has expert power. And that will be able to give you the confidence to trust their decision making process, and therefore that gives them a certain level of authorization to behave in a particular manner or to act on things in the organization. Reverent power refers to the nature and strength of a relationship between two or more people. Think of a wise senior who is so highly regarded that her words carry great weight in the organization's group discussion. So there are lots of people in organizations who have this reverent power. They may not necessarily be in a position of power. They may not have positional power, but they have a reverent power because of maybe they've been with the organization for long, or they have shown themselves to be very good in analyzing the situation that's facing them. So people end up with that type of power, reverent power. I don't know if anybody here, some of you might be a bit young to be able to get to this point, but you can have it. It could come up as a result of having a great deal of expertise in one area, and just your force of personality can create that sort of like people defer to you to get positions and point of view. What you think about something is, or how you think about something is very important to other people about how you feel because you kind of have that power by reference. Legitimate power is based upon the formal rule that you have in the organization. That is the power that is decreed to you or given to you by your position in the organization. Um, but that is just paper power basically, and your use of it has to be very, very. You have to be very careful with it because it only exists because you have that rule, and if that rule is ever taken from you, that power is gone. I remember had a lecturer who became a head of department, and I remember having a chat with her one time afterwards, and she said she could never go back to being just a lecturer. She will always have to be a head of department, but she don't think she can manage losing her legitimate power. And I found that was such a very immature statement to make because they were so afraid of losing power. And that's something that a lot of people um, exhibit. And as a result of that, the way in which she used her authority was in a very she sees a lot of she used a lot of punishment in her stuff. She'd be belittling people and buffing them and that kind of stuff. It was really kind of immature with the way in which she used her right of power.
She has some serious insecurities.
Yeah, it has to do with insecurity, but it was very immature of her, I think, especially for somebody who arrived at that position primarily because there was a lack of anybody else interested in it. So it was really something kind of weird. But we see how it goes. Then you have coercive power, and this is one where somebody has the situation where they can punish you. So coercive power works because you can threaten people through your position. So threatening punitive sanctions or removing rewards or benefits. So I can either give you a bonus or not, or I can sanction some sort of punishment for you, like maybe have you suspended or something along that. Think of teachers from that. Even parents use this kind of coercive power. You could get punished by your parents because you're not doing something. That's coercion, and that coercion is something that we utilize. We talked about this at the beginning when we talk about trying to get behavior modification taking place, but it's probably the least effective method for getting people to cooperate and to take on responsibility. Um, So it's not a power that ought to be used a lot, if at all. Although sometimes you might find yourself having to take action because of non-compliance. All right. Then we have reward power. This is it's similar to coercive in the sense that you can you end up with this power through the ability to give out positive outcomes or desired resources. So because you are in a particular position, you have the ability to give out this power. So it might be extrinsic, like giving out pay increases, plaques, or special privileges, or it might be intangible by simply, giving support and praise to people. So reward power that gives an individual power because they're seen as being the person who can dispense this power. If you understand what that means, I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes
Do
sense.
you
Yes.
think that the style of parenting that our parents would have used with us in terms of these different categories of power,
Uh-huh.
it would influence the way, when we are adults, the way that we handle positions of influence and
Yes.
the way we react and interact with our subordinates or our peers.
Yes. Yes. They do have an impact unless you've done some introspection and understand that maybe the way in which you've learned about using power is not going to work in each environment, and that's something that kind of common sense tells you. You can't go and use coercive power, but although that's not so true because I've seen some people treat other staff members as if they're children.
Like in the example you would have given before with the lady.
Yeah. So it's something that for whatever reason the person comes into the situation and they're behaving in a way in which they are. This is something actually that a lot of teachers get accused of, actually, that when they're in their home environment, because they're constantly in charge of younger people or other people in a classroom situation, they tend to behave in a particular manner.
And talk to everyone as though they're children. Yes, that's
Yeah.
true.
And that's something that as a teacher you have to kind of pay attention to, what you're doing. But I think good teachers are able to navigate through that quite well. Um, Unfortunately, when you get upset, though, you might kind of revert back to that teaching perspective kind of thing. So we'll see how that works out.
But how do you break that habit that would have been embedded in you from since childhood? Even though you would have had the information, as you would have rightfully said, when you get angry, it comes back out. How do you break it?
Well, through practice. That's what this model is telling you. That once you realize that you have an issue, it takes effort and practice to be able to change your own behaviors. Because if you view it as something that you don't want to be doing because it has a negative impact, then you might find yourself slipping, but it's going to take time to make a change to not do it. It's sort of like between, like, with couples. Couples might Somebody in a relationship might behave in a certain manner that other people might not like, the other person doesn't like, and you tell that person, say, I don't like this, the way you speak to me, as if I'm a child. And that may be because they've seen their parents behave in that way, and they're behaving in that manner because it's a learned behavior. It means that the individual has to want to change, first off. They have to recognize that it's not something they ought to be doing with you. It's something that they can possibly do with their children, if you have children, where there's that type of power dynamic playing off. But within the relationship, you want to be more equitable with the use of your power, but it's going to take time. My dad and my mom had that problem because my dad was a teacher, my mom was a nurse, and my father would kind of talk down to my mom a lot because of that. And I don't think he meant to do it, but he was so fixed in his behavior because he speaks to everybody that way, or he spoke to everybody in that manner. And it took a long time for him to be able to get over that. But I don't think there was a conversation that he had with himself and with my mom to identify that as a critical issue that they wanted to do. So it's something that a lot of individuals have to pay attention to. If you know that you have learned some sort of behaviors that don't necessarily work well in all circumstances, then you have to understand from your own process of self reflection and learning that you need to be paying attention to when you behave or have to do certain things, that you don't revert back to that type of behavior that feels like your conditioned response to a situation. So that's something you have to pay attention to and you're going to work on it. That's the challenge that you face. Huh? All right. So this is what kind of what comes up here. You may intentionally use some sources of power. For example, you might be prepared very well before a meeting so that you use expert power. Conversely, others may attribute some source of power to you without you even knowing it. For example, when somebody fears your disapproval because you have reverent power, that's because I don't want this person to be disappointed in me because this person, I give to them, I give to, you ascribe that person the power of reverent power. I want their approval because I know they're important. Their view matters to me, and therefore I don't want them to get things. So that's something that parents have. Parents have reverent power from their children.
I
They
was
don't.
never going to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Say that again.
No, I said that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. And the situation is that because you want your parents' approval for something, you're gonna want to do things to be able to please them, and that's not necessarily something that augurs well for empowerment purposes. So you have to be careful with having power and knowing how to use the power, but also being able to dispel some of the situations with it. Because I mean, you're not going to love your children any less if they do things to disappoint you. Yes, you're going to be disappointed, but you're not supposed to love them any less, right? Yes. Huh?
Yes.
And you see that's one of the things that happens, when children do things that disappoint their parents, it feels as if nobody loves me anymore, and that scares children because you have to remember the love of a parent is the first love that they experience, and it means the absolute world to them. And if they don't get that feeling of I am loved and I'm cherished by my parents or parent, then um, they're going to grow up with some serious problems. Right? And that's one of the things that I get with a lot of children growing up now. They have this feeling of I get the impression that there's a gap where what I do is more important than who I am as an individual. And we tend to do that ourselves as well, too, for ourselves as well. In many cases, and this is we give power away. We do it when we do not trust our own opinions or if it contradicts that of an expert. So we tend to doubt ourselves and therefore give up expert power to somebody else who we perceive as being an expert. When the person with legitimate power announces a plan or approach, we give that power away if we do not say, let's talk about that first, because you're the leader or you're the person who's given the post of a manager, you can give up that power to the person who's been given the post. But did you ask to discuss it with the person, or did the person entertain that discussion? That's sort of like the individual that Sanchez was talking about, where I think it was Sanchez, I'm not sure, um, who says, do it my way or no way at all. That kind of, because they are in a position of power, he's not entertaining a discussion about it. So it's not that we give that power away, but eventually what happens to that individual is that people avoid working with them because they know they don't have a say in how things are done. And that person is not willing to give up or relinquish that legitimate power that they think they have. Okay. We may also have power attributed to us that is undeserved. When the group assumes, for example, this is a great example. When the group assumes that because you are an English major or a language major, you will be best at writing the group's report. There may be an error. Would you agree with something like that? Anybody here is a language major? Or somebody who's been given power in an organization or in a group? Um,
So since I have been involved in drama, fluid drama classes in Form 3, Form 5, anytime we would have a group project, they would assign me to be like one of the head actors when I would always push for other people to take on, lead roles. Because even though I have experience in the field, that don't mean I will be able to execute it better than anyone else in the group.
right. So that is one of the issues that comes up because you're given power that you really don't have. What happens when that happens? What do you do when that happens, though? That's another thing that you have to pay attention to. How do you respond?
Well, in those situations, at first, in like the first few times it happened, I felt validated for one, because I felt like I was being acknowledged for what I was good at. But eventually it got tiring because it feels like people expect too much and you don't necessarily have all the courage to meet those expectations.
True, which means that um, you
You
might be
work
having
under pressure.
yeah, you might be having an issue with actually following through. So your expertise is not extended to where people have given you either reverent power for it. So you understand that there's a discrepancy there between the two. All right. Okay. Power is not finite and indeed can be shared and amplified. Some think that power should be framed differently and seen with a similar frame as love. The more you give away, the more you get. Do you agree with that? Beatles said it, the more love you make is the more love you get to take. Interesting concept. Conventional leadership paradigm sees the sharing of power as indecisive or the avoidance of your responsibility, and that is a negative there in relation to that. Um, and that's what we want to get away from. We don't want to see sharing power as a negative. We want to see sharing power as a positive. Others may abuse power shared with them, but those in legitimate authority roles who share their power usually find that they build stronger groups. That's another thing that happens. For society to get its work done, leaders and the system over which they preside must be granted some measure of power. So, yes, that's true. If you don't share your power, then other people can't get the job done that you want to do. There's a common experience for leaders today to have far less power than they need to accomplish the tasks that we hand them. They must have the power to do so. So that's another thing that happens sometimes. You give somebody your responsibility, but you don't give them the authorization to do certain things. That means you're giving the person the responsibility, but not the authority or the power to act. And that's sort of like crippling somebody or handicapping somebody before they even get into working towards the goal that you want them to get done. That's a problem that some organizations do. Those who hold up power must be held accountable. Leaders are in a great position of power when they hold themselves accountable first before waiting for others to implement a
So
system.
that could be possibly why giving the person the responsibility and not the power happens.
Yeah, because they
Because
don't
people
trust.
who are in power are accountable.
Right, but the person who's held accountable, um, yeah, but you can't give somebody a job to do, all right, and not give them the power to be able to act. That is self-defeating. You might be afraid. We see, but when that's the whole thing. When you give somebody power, they become accountable. You have to remember when remember the two aspects of power. getting power gives you the capacity to act and be and do things, but at the same time, it you have a responsibility now to deliver. All right, so that's why this part is important here. If you've been given power and you haven't been given a system of checks and balances, if you create your own accountability system and before without waiting for others to do it, then you are showing respect for that power. All right, because this part here, hoarding power in leadership, risks negative responses from others, such as sabotage, withdrawal, resistance, anger. There's all this kind of passive aggressive behavior that you see taking place in workplaces where people don't have any power, they don't want to do the work, but all they're going to do is just the bare minimum. Um, they're just going to do the bare minimum to get everything done, but they're not going to go beyond that. You understand what I mean? Sorry about that, just distracted by a message.
So, where my thoughts are, let's say, for example, you have the COO of a company
Hmm.
and he has senior managers under him.
Right?
He has to report to a board of directors.
Correct?
And he would have given his senior managers certain responsibility, but not the authority to actually make decisions, primarily because he's the person who's responsible for making those decisions. And even if he were to pass that responsibility to senior managers, he's still accountable to a board.
Yeah, I'm saying no.
So even if so this is just where my thoughts are at. So even if he were to implement accountability for measures for his senior managers, he still has to account to a board.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, he can't get it done without the help, can he?
True.
Right? And if he
But that's
doesn't,
why he has senior managers for them to do it.
right? So if he can't motivate his staff to be able to do that, and he continues holding the power, which is what you're talking about there, to make those. That means every time somebody has to make a decision, they have to come to him. That slows the process down. So he's never going to be on time with getting things done. All right. What he has to do is when in sharing his power or giving power over to these people is make them understand that listen, I need this by a certain date and time done because of the consequences that are likely to come. Ultimately, he is responsible for what the organization does. You follow me?
Yeah.
That is his responsibility. But for every nitty gritty, remember, CEOs and those people, managing directors, are at the helm of an organization to work its direction out. The day to day management and activities of a firm really lie not in the CEO's wheelhouse, but in the
Junior management.
yes, which we call the executive management team. And if your board of directors is so short-minded, short-sighted to reprimand only the CEO when it's a team failure for a particular event taking place, then they're missing the point.
But this keeps happening at WASA especially.
Yeah,
They keep moving senior management,
uh-huh.
and the problems keeps reoccurring.
And that's because the structure that they have in place there is one that is crippling to anybody who goes into a position of power there. They have no decision making power. Everything has to pass through back through the ministry. Do you ever realize how government boards work?
Yeah.
For a CEO of a company can't spend any money beyond a certain amount. All right. And half the time when they have to make those kind of spending decisions, the spending decisions have to fall within a particular dollar value. I remember I think our CEO at Costard had a $1 million um, a $1 million ceiling. Was it $1 million? I can't remember, but he had some sort of limitation. And what he used to do when he had a project running that was beyond the limit, he would break the project up into several different decisions and budget it separately and get it done because it was taking too long to get the decision passed through the board, then up the line to the minister for approval for it to come back down to sign. So he took it upon himself to make those kind of decisions. Now, of course, what he was doing was circumventing the system because you had power hoarding taking place in the system, and that's what happens in the situation. The people to make the decisions were hoarding power, keeping it within their control, and that therefore results in the negative responses you see taking place. Sabotage. So the only problem with it is that in the case of the CEO or the president of the college, they had to bear the brunt of when things went wrong, what happened. All right. So your CEO has to motivate his people to be able to move beyond that. That is his challenge. So he might need to change some members of his team or promote some people into things. Um, he has to go into and understand the personalities involved and that kind of stuff too, because you can have some square pegs and round holes, and that's what happens in Warsaw a lot. A lot of square pegs and round holes, and people who have very passive, aggressive behaviors where they're not going to do anything and they are circumvented by union rules and that kind of stuff. So to get anything done is a whole heap of nonsense that goes on. Self-empowerment. This is empowerment is claiming the power that you should have for any position in an organization. Self-empowerment then is the recognition that you have a legitimate right to be heard and the self-confidence to be part of the solution or the change process. The E word by itself is a non sequitur unless it is used with self-discovery. It provides a means of empowering yourself as you explore your natural, educational, and professional attributes and sizing up your leadership perspectives. So your responsibility is also to empower yourself as well. If you don't, then I take it that that manager that you're talking about is a good example of somebody who needs to engage in some of his own self-empowerment because he's holding the power when he ought to be giving it out, and that might actually help with and with the power, you also farm out the responsibility too. That's the other element. All right. 6 methods through which you might become empowered: educating, that makes sense; leading, structuring, creating structural factors such as arranging your day, bringing people to the table, changing policies and processes so that change lives beyond the people who create it. So that those are 3 there. Providing, making sure others have resources to get their job done. Mentoring, having a close personal relationship. So that's something that you could utilize. And actualizing, taking it on, being empowered and claiming it. Taking it on and claiming it, basically. Valuing the empowerment of all members creates a larger group of participants or citizens who generally take more ownership of group tasks and processes and who feel committed to the outcomes of change. So again, it's about creating that group move towards it. So if his junior management staff don't feel that the empowerment is worth their while, then they're not going to do it. And they're not going to act on it because maybe they're seeing it as it doesn't help me, it just gives me more work. But that's the problem that comes with good work, and good work brings more work. Empowerment takes you, places you at the center of what is happening rather than at the edges where you might feel inconsequential. This may be understood best by examining the concepts of mattering and marginality. Sorry. Mattering is a motive. The feeling that others depend on you, on us, are interested in us, are concerned with us, our fates, or exercise our influence of power. So this is what I was talking about before. When you feel inclusive and you feel empowered, then you feel like what you do is matters. But in new situations and new roles with new people, we may feel marginal, as if we do not matter unless the group welcomes us in and seeks our meaningful involvement. So that's part of the problem that comes up. So that if you try to understand that those feelings of mattering and marginalization, mattering is the feeling that we are significant, whereas marginalization is the feeling that we are not important, and the only way we matter is when the group brings us in, and that's something that some leaders suck at. Really, they don't understand how to bring people in from the margins, and it may not be new members; it may be existing people in the organization that feel marginalized, and the more marginalized they feel, the less they will do to move the organization forward. And unfortunately, when the example you're giving in WASA, those are government positions where they are government appointed. And the problem with it is that if the persons are feeling marginalized, their lack of activity will reflect negatively on the ability of the CEO to be able to move the organization forward, because he's unable to get those individuals to act in a manner because they feel marginalized by the wider organizational process. The other thing that might be creating a problem in this situation there is the bureaucracy of the circumstances or situation that faces them. And that bureaucracy in itself can become a serious barrier to moving things forward. Here we talk about empowering environments. Groups, organizations, or environments can promote mattering, or can compete, or can keep people on the peripherals or in the margins. You need an environment that helps to develop that situation of moving people from the margin to the core. Because if they can't do that, then they're not going to be able to build that that feeling of we can get this done together. That fundamental shift of mind in which individuals come to see themselves as capable of creating the world they truly want rather than merely reacting to circumstances beyond their control. And fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of us have worked or currently work in situations where we feel this way, that we are simply going to work to pay the bills, and we are simply going to do what's necessary and respond to the circumstances as they come up. And that's if you're working in a job like this, I would say you need to leave. It's probably one of the most deliberate, dangerous places to be working in. But your circumstances may be in such a way that you can't afford to leave, and that is even more problematic, because that leads to a lot of alienation on the part of you and the employee, and it doesn't help anybody, because you feel that's where you start to look for other things to do. That's why people go to work, and sometimes you don't see them because they're actually doing things they want to do, but they're not dealing with that. Or they're at work and they're researching other projects that they want to work on, or all kind of stuff like that. So a whole set of issues that come up with that. They don't feel part of the organization anymore. That is a very important thing that you want to do. Empowerment will happen in organizations where people recognize that things can always be better than they are now, and that's sometimes hard to do. Because if you look at an organization and you can't get beyond the organizational culture of this is the way things are, and you have to accept it that way, then you're probably not going to bother with trying to make any sort of changes, and you're not going to want to do anything. They also try to eliminate the fear of trying and humiliation, and operate on trust and inclusivity. And I don't see that really happening in a lot of organizations. If you don't feel empowered in any particular group, you might assess the dynamics in the organization to see if they are encouraging or controlling. And that is something that I think is what is going on with your situation that you brought up there in thing. They're not encouraging. All they're doing is they're controlling the environment, and that doesn't speak to empowerment. That speaks to just I have to stay in control of things in order to make sure things get done because at the end of the day, I am responsible for it. Um, there may be an in group and an out group. How many of you all are familiar with this concept, in groups and out groups? So you're working in an organization, and there's a group of people who are excluded from information and opportunities in the organization, and then you have the in group that they, they always know when to have this available and that available and whatnot, and they seem to always be in the loop. So where are you in your organization, the in group or the out group? When you want to get rid of that in and out group, you want to get in a situation where everybody feels in. If the organization dynamics are basically supportive, however, perhaps you need to enhance your self empowerment by building competencies, networking, or attributes to let you make a more meaningful contribution. So there's a whole host of things that people can do to be able to do that. Empowerment and delegation are not the same. That's an important thing here, which may be something that's happening. A leader cannot give tasks to participants to do, no matter how important those assignments may be, and simply assume that the participants will subsequently feel empowered. Indeed, if the leader retains a great deal of power or control when delegating, participants may feel manipulated, unprepared, resentful, and victimized. That sounds like what's happening in that situation there. Because they're not giving the power over, then they're just saying, well, I have this to do and I'll make you do it, basically. That's kind of like how it feels sometimes in some organizations, because you get all the work but none of the rewards, basically, at the end of the day. Conversely, if a positional leader has clearly acted congruently in sharing authority and responsibility, now notice they're always talking about sharing authority and responsibility. Yeah? So at the end of the day, authority and responsibility go hand in hand. Um, then you'll develop a sense of shared responsibility and shared empowerment, and that will help to build a better community or better group. Empowerment is achieved by enabling these involvements of group members and conveying faith in them. All right, so now we come up to the ethical aspects of moral leadership, and chapter 6 from both textbooks that will be presented will be treating with this in much more detail. So the relationship, the RLM model emphasizes the ethical and moral values of the system. It believes wholeheartedly that the model is driven by values and standards. And leadership that is good, moral in nature. And that is what the language we use to examine ethical, moral leadership is of the utmost importance. Some have a tendency to use the term ethics and morals interchangeably, but there's some differences there. Others differentiate between them, yet draw a strong relationship between ethics and morals. Ethics is the social rules that govern and limit our conduct, especially the ultimate rules concerning a right and wrong. The derivation of ethics is from ethos, from the Greek word for character and sentiment of the community. Other definitions of ethics includes the principles of conduct governing an individual or profession and standards of behavior. Being ethical means conforming to the standards of a given professional group. So are you all familiar with the Nurses Pledge or the Hippocratic Oath for doctors?
Slightly, sir.
All right. If you work in any profession, there are, right. So, for example, in the teaching profession, we have we have a lot of rules, code of conduct that emanates from the Ministry of Education. Those are rules that govern our behavior in a classroom and outside the classroom as well, too, interestingly enough. And those types of rules are what they're talking about here. They are the ethics created by a standard of behavior. So you're trying to behave in a particular manner. Ethical standards, whether they are established by an individual or an organization, help to guide a person's decisional actions. For the purpose of this model, ethics will be defined as rules or standards that govern behavior. So that you kind of have to remember what this model is all about. It's therefore rules or standards that govern behavior. Ethical standards, whether they are established by an individual or organization, have to guide a person. All right, so that's just repetitive. I have to get rid of that extra slide. Principles like values, ethics, standards, and morals provide true north directions to our lives when navigating the streams of our environment. Interesting. So supposedly, our ethical values are supposed to point us in the right direction. That's why they refer to it as true north. Professions also often establish codes of ethics or standards that serve as normative expectations for people in a particular profession. So, you ought to do this, or you should be doing this kind of stuff. That's the language in which it tends to be codified in. I know that the accounting ACCA put out a new set of ethical codes for their behavior and for auditing and stuff like that because of the problems that they had in the late 2000s with coming out of the whole housing thing that went on and whatnot. There had a lot of problems coming out, and therefore they kind of relooked at their professional ethics. That's another element that you want to look at. Morals. So morals means relating to principles of right or wrong, or arising from one's conscience, or as a sense of good and evil, pertaining to the discrimination of good and evil, instructive of what is good or evil. Morals are commonly thought to be influenced by religion or personal beliefs. Moral leadership is concerned with good leadership, that is, leadership with good means and good ends. So this is where things become a little hazy.
So would you also say that morals stem from societal norms?
Yes, but where do societal norms come from? If you
What
think
you
about
stated before?
yeah, it actually comes from religion. The same sources give us our norms,
Yeah.
religious beliefs and practices, um, history and cultural beliefs as well. All right. So our philosophy of leadership is value driven. Again, our definition underscores this. Leadership is a relational and ethical process. So they keep on reminding us that the definition that they're looking at requires that we look at relational leadership as an ethical process of working together with other people in an ethical manner to achieve change. Leaders and followers have to act out of shared values. And that is where some of the problems come up because there are different things that create changes in our value structures, which can cause serious problems for us working together. Um, you are familiar with the generational gap? Most of you all should be familiar with the generational gap, right? Anybody?
Not in like
What
detail, but
aspect of it, Zosa?
Huh?
What aspect of it?
So do
Well,
you mean like the Gen Z, Gen Y,
yes. The,
boomers?
yeah, the generational gaps cause problems where moral values tend to change over time.
That's true.
And the generational gap that exists within an organization where you may have an older leader and younger workers or younger followers, there may be a disconnect between the moral values seen by or acted upon by the leader as those that are acted upon by their followers. So this is where sometimes you have some sort of problems that come up because some people might be looking upon that person's behavior as being old-fashioned. So the action, if you look at what it says here, it the action of leaders and participants emanate a from a shared set of values, which we hope are congruent, which is consistent between both groups and shared between both groups. Values are freely chosen personal beliefs. You have to remember, we freely chose these personal beliefs. Now, freely chose is kind of weird because most times our choices were guided by what took place in our lives and guided by our parents and guided by what took place in our lives, because there are people who do not live lives the way we have generally all experienced it, and therefore their personal choices are different. This is especially when you're dealing with people who tend to be on the fringes of society and behave in manners that we think are unethical. So people who spent most of their life operating or growing up under the influence of criminal elements in their society. So think about a child growing up in a household where theft was a regular thing, the use of drugs was a regular thing, violence was a regular thing. They're going to grow up looking at those behaviors as shaping their values, where the value of strength is power, and therefore, if once I am stronger than everybody else, then I will have power, and that means power by any means, meaning that I would have power by violence, and that starts to work itself into the behavioral path thing. And you can't challenge my power. If you challenge my power or you challenge my position, I have to beat you down, because that's what I saw happening in my household, and that's what I understand. So what we're looking at here is a wider subset of values that they're talking about in the book. But you have to remember, individuals are coming up with different sets of values, and then when you take into consideration the age variation between the leaders in traditional organizations and the followers, there may be a serious disconnect that creates problems and creates dilemmas. Okay? Although there is much disagreement in the literature about whether leadership is values neutral or values driven, it is safe to say that most people expect leaders to do the right thing. This is basically what we say. We want our leaders to do the right thing and act in a particular way. It's important for leaders to be upright, honest, and ethical in their dealings. Yes, we all want that from our leaders. Unfortunately, few of us believe that our leaders exhibit these qualities, especially in government. Because we always look at the behaviors that we see and we say, and then that fellow is incapable of that. That's really horrible, bro. That we can look at our people and leaders in government and say that they're unable to do that. Leaders and citizens, our challenge today is to choose the gap between our expectations of ethical leadership and the reality of frequent breaches of ethical conduct by our leaders. We need bold, courageous leaders and leadership that is by word and deed ethical and moral. This is a huge challenge that we're talking about here in this model. This model asks you to be ethical, act ethically, and be moral and values driven. And that's a dangerous kind of thing here, because now we start to get into the situation as to what moral values do we utilize, right? It's encouraging that a growing number of people have expressed their abhorrence for breaches of ethical conduct by national and local leaders. That a vast majority of the population believe that ethics plays a critical role in leadership. Now, a lot of you may have had the experience of dealing with people who are unethical but in leadership positions. And what happens to them when they are exposed is going to be critical. Because if we don't see some form of I don't know, some responsibility or consequence to their behavior, then that begins to chip away at the leadership that we see in front of us. That is part of a problem that I see happening here. That um, everybody's so careful to. I mean, I don't know. I remember there've been so many little situations that occurred, and it seems almost as if the person suffered no consequences as a result of doing what they did. Thinking right now of do you remember that guy Darren Smith? he was minister in sports or something like that. Any of you all remember that? No?
So I remember.
Um, what was his situation again? He had gotten involved in some sort of unethical behavior with female employees. And it took a long while for the leadership to do something about it. Eventually, he was removed from office, correct?
Yeah.
But I found that because it was so slow to act, it almost negated the act when it did take place. It making sense? What about the situation with the minister who was found to have what's going on with her, boy? I think she was brought up in court for stealing money or something like that. I think she used to be in the Ministry of Social Welfare, one of those ministries. And I don't want to harp on any one individual or any group by that chance, because it happens with everybody, with every political party. And the point that's happening is that as a population, we're looking at people that have been given, that we have given leadership responsibility to, betray our trust so often, and then nothing seems to happen to them. And that then leads us into a problem where the followership starts to look at that behavior as being normal, and then we expect that behavior to be pervasive throughout our society. So it's a kind of top-down situation. I remember one of the lecturers that I worked under used to say that fish is rotten from the head. I don't know if you all understand that.
Yes.
So that's where the leadership starts to corrupt the entire society.
Organization.
Yeah, well, the entire society. When we talk about leadership from a government perspective, you know, look at the situation that's going on with the president that right now. I mean, have they resolved that? Did they get that sorted out yet? I've kind of lost. I haven't been paying attention to that, I must say, because it's just. And that's the other thing too. I've become very dismissive of those behaviors. So like, and that which is not good. Because I've come to expect the nonsense all the time, and that's not a good thing. That's horrible, actually. That I can be dismissive about something as critical as that. In any functioning society, everything leadership and everything else takes place within a set of shared beliefs, and this is where I have some problems, because it's almost as if we don't have the same shared set of value systems that work in our society. One of the tasks of leadership is to revitalize those shared values and beliefs. This is something that if we have new leaders coming into the realm, they have to work really hard at doing this, because from the political sphere, we've been let down so much that other leaders are suffering the anti-leader virus because of it in a huge way in this country. Leaders can help to make values fresh. Well, they can combat the hypocrisy that proclaims values at the same time that they violate it. So, I don't know. Whenever I read this chapter, I get very upset because of this section, because this is what I see taking place in our society all the time, and this is what is not supposed to happen. What we're looking at here is what should be taking place. All right, but I don't know. I don't know. I mean, well, let's try and understand our history and our current circumstances or situations. They have a role in creating the state of mind that exists in our societies, and leaders must conceive and articulate goals in ways that lift people out of those petty preoccupations and unite them towards. There's a lot of responsibility for a leader. And I'm thinking particularly in the governance role of the country. This is a huge responsibility. And it's something that I think we have failed consistently with in our country in particular. Without a commitment to doing the right thing or sound code of ethical standards, leadership cannot emerge. And that is without a doubt is one of the issues that I think we are facing. Ethical leadership is redundant because leadership cannot be experienced without an element of ethics. We feel that leadership that lacks ethical behavior and actions is anything but leadership. But that's not true because you could have unethical leadership as well. The ultimate test of moral leadership is its capacity to transcend the claims of multiplicity of everyday wants and needs and expectations to respond to the higher levels of moral. So what he's saying here is that moral leadership has to rise above the everyday humdrum and has to project people and encourage and motivate people to want better in life, to want better in society, to work together to get that. Because, I am holding myself to a higher set of ideals or moral values, and I want all of us to do it. That's what our leadership should be doing. But I don't see that as something I haven't seen anybody embody this in a long time. And it's kind of sad to say. The only person that I've seen on an international forum that kind of brings this to mind is the president of Canada, but I know he's under some problems at this point in time too. I know he has some issues coming up. Along with the thinking to cast leadership in a moral foundation is the shift in societal view from leadership as values neutral to values driven. So this is one of the problems that leadership philosophy faces. Should leadership be values neutral? Should we suspend our value systems when we're in position of leadership? Or should we be utilizing our values and ethics in leadership? So moral or ethical leadership is driven by knowing what is virtuous and what is good. So the assumption that this theory is going to be making, or this approach is going to make, is that we want it to be values driven. That individuals arriving at positions of power are coming in with good ethical values, and they are going to exhibit it across the board and be honest and virtual about it across the board. That's important. So, an exercise leader and a participant must ponder soul-searching questions such as, what do I stand for? How far am I willing to go to advance the common good or to do the right thing? It's a hard question. All right. Based on their research on leaders, these individuals propose 5 practices of exemplary leadership. One of these, of course, is modeling the way, which is practicing what you preach. That's the key element of the doing part of it. You have to act and lead by example. And that's basically what this part of the text is talking about. Leading by example provides very powerful examples or images to the individuals to be able to see what you're doing. What you do speaks loudly that I can't hear what you say. I like that expression. What you do speaks so loudly that I can't hear what you say. That's because a lot of people behave in one way but speak another way. And we don't.
Action speaks louder than words.
Yeah, and that is so important because a lot of times that's the way it works. Cautionary note that advises actions without authenticity erodes what can be considered ethical or moral. Terry defines authenticity as genuineness and a refusal to engage in self-deception, which is probably the worst deception. Being true to oneself as a leader is a prerequisite for ethical and moral leadership. That's a really critical thing that we have to look at. The task of leading by example is not an easy one. Most leaders begin with the goal of wanting to do the right thing. Some leaders get derailed by peer pressure. That's true. Some people start off well, and then the pressure of the organization, the pressure of people around them, and other people at similar positions push them into other things. Um, or the temptation to trade leading for the common good with leading for personal gain or for uncommon good. And that's another thing that comes up because a lot of people trade off their intention. And you know, the hard part about this is some countries, I've known historically speaking that there's some leaders who have risen up in different countries and they were doing things for the good of everybody. Um, and they were derailed not by peer pressure but by threats from large, powerful organizations. And and because they may not have taken it up, they were actually removed from their leadership positions by force. If you ever want to read about some stuff like that, there's a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Read that. See if you can find out what I'm talking about there. What sustains ethical and moral leadership is a stubborn commitment to high standards, which include honesty, trustworthiness, authenticity, organizational values, and doing the right thing. Again, these are the values that we want to see. Do you see anybody in your everyday life that encompasses these kind of things?
Yeah.
Fortunately, it might be somebody close to you, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. But what about in wider society?
Not really.
And see, that's my problems. Why this part of the course or this chapter generally gets me kind of upset sometimes. Um, so although it appears that we are stating the obvious, um, it's still unfortunate how many times we see that this is never followed. Um, Numerous accounts of leaders who have been caught embezzling, putting humans at risk for the sake of profits and hiding the truth. It's endemic, first and foremost. Leading with integrity is not a neat and tidy process, but it is probably the driving force that allows leaders to continue in their capacity. And to be honest, a lot of leaders continue leading regardless of that because they're not brought to bear the consequence of those behaviors. Processes refer to the group, how the group goes about being a group, remaining a group, and accomplishing a group's purpose. So here now we're talking about the process, that the last element I'm talking about here now. It refers to the recruitment and involvement of members, how the group makes decisions, and how the group handles. So there is a chapter on groups and teams that will be dealing with this with much more detail in this. But the importance about this process is that the process involves the group, and the group has to reinforce what's going on within the relational model. Each individual comes in as an individual, but they have to get together and work as a group to participate to accomplish that change. The process creates energy, synergy, and momentum, and that's what they keep on talking about. We help lift each other up basically to be able to get to that point of where things work. When groups design and implement ethical, inclusive, empowering processes that further a shared purpose, they can trust the process to take them through difficult times, resolve ambiguous tasks, and be assured that together they will be better than they might be individually. And that's actually a really important element of this process. Too often, the process devalues um, yeah, too often the process devalues into um, Right. It values the people involved, being highly controlled, valuing winning at all costs, excluding or shutting out those who have an interest in change. So you tend to get this marginalization taking place within groups as well, where people are not necessarily left at the margin but are pushed to the margin because they're not willing to go along with these behaviors. Exxon was a great example of this nonsense taking place where everything was I don't know if you all remember this, but there was a point in time where they were making speeches where they said greed is good. I don't know if you all remember that. Too Big to Fail. There's a film about it as well. Um, Too Big to Fail. Check it out and see. Attending to the process means being thoughtful and conscious of how groups. Now, this goes on to just keep on talking about the process and how it reinforces all aspects of the model to be able to get meaningful leadership or good leadership processes put in place to develop a good leadership um, mechanism that can be utilized to develop good. Because one of the things that we have to remember too is that the model also tries to set it up in such a way that you create more leaders in the process. But it keeps reiterating things like reflection, collaboration, civil confrontation, civil building, profound understanding, core meaning making, that kind of stuff. But the idea is that, I mean, because I think it's well after, yes, it's after 9, so I don't want to, there's a few more slides to go. I think you guys can go through this. It's really the last elements of the it goes cooperation and collaboration. So you guys can go through this on your own. And meaning making, yeah. Yeah, you guys can go through this. But the whole idea is that the model is designed to get us to a point where so these are the summary areas here. So all right. Yeah, and it's going to take some time for us to develop these models and develop your skills across the board. All right. Any questions? See, we lost some people along the way. All right. Let me stop the recording now.